2022 is almost over, 2023 is almost here, which means it's time to start thinking about next year's marketing strategies if you haven't started already. And a part of this is obviously, what are you going to do with creators next year? So today we're going to talk about what should you be taking into consideration, what are the things you should be putting down in your plan, and so on. Now, before we go into the actual checklist of things, I wanted to highlight a couple of more general principles that you should take into account, and then we can dig into the details. But yeah, first of all, so what should you be thinking about when you make this plan? And I think this is something that anytime you're thinking about marketing strategies and marketing plans, when you're thinking ahead, there's always the temptation of making it super detailed, like the exact amount of money you're planning to spend on a channel, or all of these kinds of details. But I think it's important to highlight that you shouldn't be making too detailed plans, especially when it comes to creator marketing, because the industry right now is changing so fast that if you do a very detailed plan at the beginning of the year, it's probably going to be outdated quite soon, I would say. And also, you build up performance gradually. If you haven't done too much creator marketing before, and if you start scaling it up, it's going to take a while for you to get to those levels of where you see how scalable is this for me and so on. So if you shouldn't be dedicating yourself to like very strict budgets, for example. And one interesting thing about creator marketing specifically is that even if ad platforms, they've had a pretty tumultuous second part of this year. And I guess also marketers are kind of changing around how much they're spending on the different ad platforms in terms of like social ads and search and so on. But the interesting thing is that the investment into influencer and creator marketing is actually still growing quite rapidly. So clearly, this is one of the channels that is working the best for many advertisers. And that's why I think it definitely deserves some special attention. But Lucas, before we jump into the kind of more practical aspects of what to consider, anything else you want to highlight before we get started on those?
Just on the planning topic, I think we'll get into the hows and the do's and don'ts after that. But if there's few names that are going to work for you and they're potentially like really booked out, just sign them as soon as possible. Some creators just take 1, 2, 3 sponsor per year with like a pretty long contract. Some just have a lot of brands that want to work with them, but are like fully booked because they have like a publishing schedule that's quite strict. So I think as soon as you see a creator that you would really want to like work with, especially true on the bigger side, definitely understand what's their publishing schedule. Is it fully booked out? Not what are the slots? Because that's definitely something that if you decide to plan from one month to the other, that will not work. At the same time, if you want to spread out the budget with like small to mid-sized creators, this should not be an issue, because if the targeting is like large enough, you should always be able to find one that would replace the other, and the names don't really matter there. It's more who the audience is for those. So yeah, just one consideration on planning, but it really depends on what one is doing. So yeah.
Sounds good. And we're going to dig into the creator selection process, you could say, in detail a bit later in this episode as well. But excellent points to take care of there. But yeah, I guess we can then get started with the the basics. So what are the kind of the very basic things you should put down in your plan for next year? And I would say, first of all, creator marketing does not exist in a void. So whatever you do with creators should be in support of your overall marketing goals. Now, whether that's increasing your sales, boosting user acquisition, improving your brand awareness, it can be one or many of these things at the same time. But whatever you're doing with creators should always support your overall marketing plan. It shouldn't be something completely separate, that you're just running somewhere on the side, because creators can boost all of these. We've seen that from customer work, that creators can boost all of these aspects extremely well. But it's just something that you should think about in broad terms as well. And the second thing is initial target audience and initial budget. And why I say initial is that you do have your core of who you're going to target, and you probably do have some idea of what kind of budget level you're going to be starting with. But in both cases, you shouldn't be locked into it too strictly, because like I said earlier, in creator marketing, once you have the right tools, it probably starts scaling up gradually as you see the results. So you don't want to be in a position where you just completely run out of budget when it's really starting to pay off. The second thing, the audiences. So typically, what performs best for you in other channels works best for you in creator marketing as well. So kind of look at the platforms and the creators that can help you reach the people you go after in other channels as well, and this can easily be proven with data. But also, I think creator marketing is special in a way that you might actually discover new audiences that work for you that don't necessarily engage with your ads on other channels. So it's also important to not be overly strict with the targeting and look at the data as you go along, because you might discover new places where to promote your products or apps or games as well. And I think the last piece, which you mentioned as well, was the special engagements. So, if you have good creators that work and are big names, book them as early as you can. But also, if you have special seasonal events coming up, so something like Black Friday, you're going to have a big Black Friday sale the next year, or this year there's the World Cup, for example, in football. But anything like this. So if there's a big special event that you want to be taking part in, definitely account for that in the plans, because for those specific periods, you probably should hire creators earlier than normal, just so you make sure you have enough inventory available. But I would say those are kind of the basic considerations before we go into the more detailed questions you should also answer. Anything to add from your side?
How do you, a small question for you, not something to add here, but how do you scale over time that budget, and how do you plan this into your marketing plan for the year? Because let's say, okay, we're here November 2022, I'm looking at what I want to do in 2023. I start to have a budget in mind for throughout the year, but then how do you build this flexibility in your plan on this is how I'm going to increase? Because if you just start from, I know I'll have this set of budget for each month, so I'm going to hire this amount of creators, but I think one thing you said, you on the go, you look at the data and kind of increase over this, but how would you do it concretely in 2023?
So obviously this depends a lot on what are your main KPIs, but overall how I would do it in creator marketing or any other marketing channel for that matter would be that decide what is your target performance level on the KPIs you care about the most, and then start with a specific budget, and if you're under that goal, first work towards reaching that goal, and once you start getting there, then work on increasing the budgets while staying on those target levels. I think that's pretty much the best way to go about it. But of course, one important thing to remember is that you need to take into account the channel's specific characteristics, I would say. So for example, if you're doing any kind of video advertising, creator marketing, even traditional TV commercials, all of these, you're not going to see, I mean, with TV, you're not going to see direct digital traffic at all. But with video ads, creator marketing, these kinds of things, your direct conversions attributable to this are not going to be as high as they are in direct response, or they could be, but most likely they won't be if you compare to Google search ads, for example. But what typically happens with these channels is that you get a lot of organic conversions, or conversions that show up in your web analytics as direct traffic or organic traffic, because people watch the video on maybe like one device, but they won't click out from that. Either what happens is that they go on that same device later on and just navigate to your website on a mobile browser if they're on the phone, or maybe they open up their laptop and go to your website to make a purchase. So it will never be attributable to your creator activation. So just take into account that you should probably have some sort of organic uplift estimation, or just set lower ROI targets, direct ROI targets at least for these channels. Of course, the whole media mix modeling and so on is a very complex topic, and you can go very deep into that, which we don't have time for in this episode. But just take into consideration the characteristics of the channel. I would say that's very important to remember.
We don't have time for this. That's clear. I think when I joined Airbnb, they were already discussing about the model. I left 5 years after. I was still in discussion and like adapting it. So yeah, no time for this.
Yeah, for sure. But if you're interested in doing it more specifically, there are things like media mix modeling you could be looking into, or if you do have a data science team which calibrates LTV models and things like this, those are probably the people you should be talking to around this. But just good to remember the overall principles.
Yeah. At the same time, I think one project that your product could work on is like, what are those like direct offers that you can only access through a link or a QR code on the videos, because then that's how you get more engagement directly on that creative. But yeah, for sure, the organic uplift is definitely in some cases needs to be taken in consideration. Otherwise, you really are not taking a look at the full picture there.
Exactly. And for example, in e-commerce, promo codes are a very good way of measuring this indirect effect as well. So there are different methods you can use on top of that. But yeah, so that's kind of the basics. So to summarize, your overall marketing goals and how can creators support that? What's the initial target audience? What's the initial monthly budget? And then what are the special engagements where you want to put more effort into during next year? But I think then there are a few of these more detailed considerations you also have to factor in. So that's when you do get the results, how do you actually do the scaling up? Because this is not social ads where you could just bump up the budget by 50,000. How do you do it in practice? How do you hire more creators? Who you should be hiring to do it the right way? Should you be hiring more kind of small and mid-sized creators, or hire more of the big stars? Then related to this, where are you going to find these creators? So should you use automatic sourcing, sort of more automated software tools, or do you go to an agency and request their talent roster and review that? And also, what are the pros and cons of each of those approaches? Both can work in specific situations, but we definitely should talk about, when to use lists and when not to use lists, for example. But yeah, so if we start from the first one of those, so I think that's the scaling piece. And I think that's the most crucial, as we already talked about. Once you start getting results, you need to be able to scale the medium up. And I think there are a few ways of doing this. First of all, like we've talked about in previous episodes, if you have a big team, one good option is increasing headcount. You're probably already quite seasoned at how when you add a new team member, how do they efficiently contact more creators? How do they how does the approval process work, and so on? So you can run a bigger team this way. Or if you're working with agencies, you can of course buy more hours from a specific agency, or maybe onboard an additional agency to help you do this. I think both are of course completely good solutions, but the fact is that this does get quite complex and also quite expensive very easily. So if you're running a very big in-house team, for example, and they're doing everything very manually, the opportunity cost of that is going to be quite massive. So how many creators and how much reach are you actually getting per dollar? The amount of the amount of reach and the amount of conversions you get for every dollar spent starts to weaken quite fast, because you're spending more time on manual tasks, you have higher salary costs, and so on. So, the campaigns can get ineffective pretty quickly if you do it this way. But of course, the other end of the spectrum is you can also do this in a more automated manner. And I think this is something that works for most brands. So you can use platforms that automate the manual activities. So looking at, do the discovery of creators, handle the outreach, sign the contracts, handle the payments once the collaboration is done, handle analytics and tracking and so forth. So this is a very good way of scaling it up as well. Of course, it doesn't mean that you need to stop everything you're doing outside of it. But it just means it gives you more focus. So if you use more automation, what you can then do is your team can focus on negotiating the biggest, most important contracts manually, because some of these creators might not be on platforms, for example. Or if you want to do a very special long-time collaboration that has complex specifications and so on, you do need to do one-to-one communication with the creator in that situation. So if you're using automation to increase your scale, make your work more efficient, it also leaves you more time to focus on these critical activations in your daily work, and not just trying to do it for every single creator out there, right?
I mean, if someone wants to spend some time on a contract for $500, maybe, but that's definitely not a good use of time. I think there's bigger deals that needs to be taken into consideration for the team members there. Yeah, so wherever you can, and especially in a product that's global, massive reach, you're just trying to reach a maximum number of users or consumers. That's definitely how you can scale it. Just leave the automation, take part of the small deals. That's fine. You know that it's gonna get some performance, some long tail after some 30 days or something like this. But then focus the team that you have on the bigger fishes. That's totally fine, and that's the model that we have with most of our clients for sure.
And I think then one of the questions people are going to be asking at this point is that, okay, but why should I be doing this then? Why don't I just go to a couple more of these big names that cost, 500,000 per video or something like this? Why don't I just make life easy for me and just hire a couple of these really big names? Why do I need these small and mid-sized creators?
I mean, you can definitely just simplify your life and do that. That's easy. You pick a few names, sign some big deals, and that's fine. But the problem is that the audience that you will get is not one-to-one. Of course, there's people watching small, mid, big, all at the same time. There's some that don't watch any big. There's some that just watch small and mid-sized creators, just to support this. Or it could be that the big creators just make a wide variety of contents that's not attractive enough for another creator. So if you have the right process in place to get 50 of those small ones, you'll get the same performance in views and potentially even better on like the engagement than going with just a big one. Plus, you spread the risk that you could get by just hiring one big name, and that's something that's quite important. It's marketing budget, so you really need to like spread the risk. It's I always take this this example as a Facebook marketer, Facebook ads marketer. You'll never spend all your budget on one ad, how do they call it again? Ad group. And then you say, that's it, I did the job, you know, and then you'll say, no, you'll have 5 to 10 creatives in like 5 to 10 like ad groups, and then you pick the winning ones, and then you double down, add more budget on there. Then that's the same with creators. You have 50 creators to start with. You find the winning one, you see those that are not performing so well, and then you continue to work with it. And that's what we're discussing. You can scale like this. You could scale by just finding bigger and bigger creators every time, but it's gonna be a pretty short road ahead, I think. And the goal of like any good marketing channel for your product is to find one that is impactful for you, but has scale. And like the big creators, we don't see it as like a good way to scale it.
Yeah, exactly. And then you already mentioned the risk. So if all of your budget is going to 2 or 3 big names, for example, if even one of them just, you know, the content they made doesn't resonate with your audience, you might have just wasted 50% of your budget right there and then just because of one creator. And that's a huge risk you're taking, especially with bigger budgets. So spreading out, you know, hiring more creators, that definitely helps with that. And as you said, you know, we've looked at some of the data, and on YouTube, for example, small and mid-sized creators, they have roughly twice the amount of engagement that the big names get. So once you're able to hire them efficiently in large amounts, you can actually get much better performance with your money. And then when you combine that with the additional reach of the big names, you can get excellent results from that. But then you're, like I said, you know, you're not so committed, you're not spending that big of a portion of your budget on just one name. You're probably getting much more incremental reach because people have different view preferences, even if they're interested in the same topic. So if they're watching gaming channels, but if you're hiring 50 different gaming channels, your incremental reach is going to be way bigger than just 1 or 2 big name YouTubers, for example. So definitely good points there. But yeah, so I would say that, you know, most brands when they start influencer marketing or creator marketing, what they do is, you know, they hire that one big name, and it can work okay, or it might not, but you know, they should be doing it the other way around. You should be hiring small and medium-sized creators first, because then you get a much broader sense of, you know, is this channel performing for me? And then once you do establish that, then adding some of the big names on top definitely makes sense. But so many brands, because they're unsure of where to start or they don't have any automation in place, simply do it the other way around, which just doesn't make sense. So, you know, look at some of these automation solutions, start from small and medium-sized creators, then start adding bigger names on top of that. You know, when you do have performance, when your budgets start going up, when you're talking about 100K plus monthly budgets, let's say, at that stage, probably makes sense to start looking at, you know, bigger names. But do keep in mind that the percentage share of one creator should never be something like 50% or 40% of your budget. So, you know, don't go hiring the biggest star out there until you get some really meaningful scale in your YouTube creator activations.
Unless you signed acknowledgement of the risk and you're like totally fine with it. I think that's definitely like one way to do it. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, then we get to the next point on the list. So how do you actually source these creators? And I would say there are 2 main ways. or maybe 3 main ways, depending how you count it, of doing this. And this is where we get to the so-called show me the list approach. So typically how many advertisers do this is that, they go to an agency, they tell them, show me your roster, I'll look at the creators that match best for me, I'll hire those, and then maybe go to another agency for another roster, and so on. Or you can even do manual outreach yourself. Then on the other end of the spectrum is solutions like Matchmade, where it's more like, give us the data parameters, who's your target audience, and what we'll then do is that we'll automatically look at the audience data of the creators in the network, and the people who have audience that you care about will go about hiring those automatically. So I think these are kind of the 2 ends of the spectrum, and both can work well in different scenarios. So let's discuss a bit about the pros and cons of each approach. And I think maybe we can start from the list approach. So, looking at a roster, choosing from there, because maybe quite a lot of advertisers are already used to doing it this way. So, when can this work the best?
Before we get into why it can't work, I think it's interesting to look at why this happens. And how I see it is, an advertiser has an idea because they looked at a channel and they say, oh, the content is great. I would actually be fun to see our product within this environment. And then they reach out to this talent creator, but then often it's a big one, and often there's a talent agency behind it, and they say, oh, thanks for reaching out. Yeah, we'll see what we can do with this creator, but maybe you should see the rest of our list, because like they manage like a few, and then that's how their goal then is like, if we are not selling this specific creator that they initially came in for, then we'll take a look at the rest of the roster, because that's the goal. They manage this pool of talent. The goal is just to like maximize this specific roster. And if you really want this creator, then it's clear that's the way forward. There's no way around it. So that's pretty simple. But it's really just starting from like a subjective perspective on, hey, my product would do well on this this channel. And then you're not really like starting from like the audience first. So sometimes you have an idea of like who the audience is, you could make some assumption, but it's not really just looking at the data from that, which is the opposite way that we do it. We look at the data first, who's watching this content, and then sending the offers to those creators. Just for why we see this.
Yeah, and I think one comment to add to this, like that's one kind of mistake that a lot of people do when they are kind of going about this, is that, if based on data, that a creator you're looking at is reaching the people you care about. So let's say people interested in gaming, 20 plus years old across the globe. If you have the data to show that this person is already engaging with that audience to a big degree, what if you start applying other considerations on top of it? So very kind of subjective things like, do I feel this creator is a match for me, or is he or she, are they X years old, for example, or things like this. What you are then doing is you're actually filtering out people who already have proven performance in your audience. So you're kind of doing, you're disqualifying people who, based on the data, would already, they have already convinced your audience. So you just think that they are not a fit, but if you look at the data, they are. So, that's why this kind of pre-selection sometimes can be quite dangerous. But of course, it depends on how granular audience data you have available from these creators and so on. But that's why I would be quite careful with, this kind of pre-selection, because a lot of times the data will tell you if it's worth working with them or not. And these other considerations, you're just like limiting your reach for no reason, even if you think you're actually improving performance in that regard. But yeah, that's kind of the, as you said, it's kind of the background of why this happens. But if we talk about the list approach or manual outreach, when can this work? And I think one of the best examples I've seen is very small markets. So if you're targeting a country that typically has their own language and a very small population, I'm from Finland. That's definitely a great example. It's a population of 5.3 million people that have their own language. Denmark, pretty similar, 5.7 million people. I think they speak their own language and so on. So if you want to reach a big amount of people in these markets, sometimes it's better to go to these agencies, because if it's a small country, there's also a smaller amount of creators available, and there's probably going to be very few people who are able to reach a big portion of that, of that country or market. And what that means is they are typically already managed by an agency or something like this. So in these smaller markets, this can typically work better because you can pretty easily find, the most critical content creators out there. You can, of course, supplement this with automated approaches, but if you're talking about these very small countries, there's not necessarily going to be that many creators available, generally speaking. So if it's only a country of a few million people with their own language as well, then this would be one reason. If it's a country that speaks a more, more popular language, like if it's a Spanish-speaking country or a smaller English-speaking country, for example, then I would say it's a bit of a different situation, because you can hire creators from other countries that also reach these markets, as long as you're not strictly limited to one of those very small English-speaking countries. But I think this is a pretty typical example of when lists can make sense. The other one is very niche audiences. You might have a couple of other examples in mind as well, but I think enterprise B2B software, let's say accounting software for big companies or something like this, is a very good example, because even if there are a lot of like software or gaming creators out there, there's going to be very few people who can credibly talk about these very specialized solutions, and there's going to be a very limited amount of buyers out there. So, if you try to find a creator like this, then it's definitely worth it going to a more specialized agency or just directly reaching out to like a really big account in one of these spaces, simply because it's so specialized that, going for big scale, it's not going to make sense, basically.
Thinking about one creator I recently came across who's I think like a B2B SDR or something like this, and he's like helping like other SDRs just get better at their job. And I think the video I landed on was when he reviewed a cold call email and a cold call. Sorry, I managed to get it. He reviewed a cold call on the video, so we could listen to his conversation with the prospect, and he just like walked us through like the negotiations that he used in that call. And yeah, I mean, there's not so many like this, but you could just be a B2B software and just go and like sponsor one of those. So in that case, clearly makes sense to just go for few names that are quite targeted, but at the same time, that you won't be able to scale the marketing channel.
All right. So as said, those are the couple of cases where the list approach can make sense. But as we said, for most advertisers, we don't actually recommend this. And why don't we do that? The recommended approach for the vast majority is that you use automated hiring to hire the creators that, based on data, are reaching your core audience, and then supplement that with with bigger names or something, or more strategic deals on top of this, for example. And why should you do it like this? Well, first of all, I think there's the time aspect to consider. Like we already talked about earlier, if you're doing all of the hiring manually, the contract negotiations manually, or you're just hiring based on a roster, it's going to cost you quite a lot of money to do this. And with automated platforms, it's just going to be quite more effective, probably. Second, if you're doing this pre-qualification, you're reducing the reach. Whereas if you're hiring most creators that based on data reach the people you care about, you're going to get the maximum reach and probably also much more cost effectiveness to go along with that. As said, data can determine who reaches your audience because this information is available on YouTube or on other platforms as well through the creators profiles as well. And this can work especially well if your audience is fairly broad. So anything like people interested in gaming or all US adults, 20 plus English speakers, 20 plus Spanish speakers across the globe, anything like this, or people living in the EU. All of these are the best reached by this kind of approach for sure. And in most cases, there's no need to kind of add your own selection criteria on top because the data can show you that these are the right creators for you specifically. And of course, if you hire a broad range of creators, you can then go and look at the data, who performed well, who performed okay, who performed really badly, eliminate the bad ones, put more effort into the good ones, hiring more similar creators to the ones that perform the best and so on. So this is why I would say for the vast majority of advertisers, especially if you're in a consumer business of any kind, apps, gaming, e-commerce, streaming apps, pretty much anything like that, this is for the most, this is going to be a much more effective alternative, I would say, for the vast majority of them.
Let's add one word to make it even more precise. Global consumer business. I think that's definitely that. I'll come back to the Facebook ads example. I was really surprised once when a former colleague told me that the best running campaign that he was running on Facebook when he was targeting the world. So it was like a global product, and then he was just letting the algorithm do its job, and that was the prime of Facebook ads. Definitely would challenge it now, but definitely targeting wide, and then help to just have amazing performance in some geos because the price of acquiring those users was extremely low, but the value of those users was extremely high, and then still balancing this with some good acquisition in the regular markets, US, Europe, and so on. And that's exactly the same when you have a global consumer product. You can go on YouTube and go wide because, okay, that initially you want to reach out to a US-based audience, and then you want to expand maybe to a Europe, but then maybe you just have an English-speaking product that's available everywhere, and that some people will find it quite useful, and that's why you're going to have it awesome results in Poland for a small subset of users speaking English, same in the Nordics, and so on and so forth. And if I look at why it's working so well for us working with Opera on a monthly basis for the past 3 years, it's because it's exactly matching this. It's a global consumer product, it's free, it's attractive to the gamers audience. So basically they just need to find all the gamers in the world and then just market the product with great features and always keep adding it. And then, as soon as you have one creator where it's working, how do you just rehire them for a couple of videos to make sure that you talk to the whole audience of this creator? And fast forward 3 years in, it's like more than 3,500 integration. I think that we've done 400 million views. So that's scale just within this segment. So there's definitely a few brands I have in mind where you could definitely work the same way. The one that was most recently thinking of is Discord. So I've seen them at the Paris Games Week last week, and I discovered that they have a new Nitro offer. So Discord, I would say pretty much any gamer on PC is now using them. Also learned that they are available on Xbox, and you have like multiple servers. Sorry, you have a question?
Just for added context, Nitro is kind of their premium paid subscription version where you get more features and so on, right?
Exactly. So they had this like premium feature for a while now. I think it's like $10 or something like this. And now a month ago, I've just discovered that they added like a $3 product. But if you think about marketing for this, everyone who has installed Discord potentially knows about Nitro as one product, which is the $10 option. But how do you go back to all of those users and really market it that way, that there's like an alternative? Of course, you can do it in app and so on, but because they already have all those like small gathered communities per creators, per game genre, per whatever, you could just like talk to all of them across the world by reaching that gaming audience and coming with like a multi-month plan on how you want to market it. So is it first you need to introduce that Nitro as like a second price plan. Third, you outline what second you outline what features this one has. Third, you kind of like repeat on this, and then you could just continue and like rehire creators where you see that the upsell is working quite well. So yeah, just wanted to share that example because that's really one that struck me and is exactly talking to this audience that we've seen work for another similar product. I don't know if you have any other examples in mind.
Sort of related to that. So that is essentially one type of subscription service. And I think that's a very good category where I'm kind of wondering why they aren't doing more creator marketing. So I would say maybe more broadly entertainment subscription services. So that's both all the video streaming, so Disney Plus, Netflix, smaller ones like Curiosity Stream, which does sort of these more science documentary and this type of content. And then also music streaming, maybe so Spotify and so on. So that's actually one category where I would imagine creators could work extremely well because, I mean, of course, you do have some variation in what content is available in which countries and so on. But especially if you have original productions and these kinds of things, they could definitely be promoting this much more because if a creator compares different streaming services, how do they find the content library to be in one platform versus another or something like this? I mean, I would imagine that could be super effective, and especially for the more upcoming streaming services, because people have very valid reasons for using those. And if if a creator were to kind of explain why do they enjoy a smaller streaming service or something like this, or why do they prefer a specific big player versus another, this could be really, really powerful because all of these streaming services spend insane amounts on video ads and performance marketing, but they're really underspending on the creator side of things, which I've found quite surprising, at least.
Or go back to the one creator per market to just like simplify the process. I've seen this recently with like a movie launch last year in France, where there was like few creators in like the countries, but in the end, yeah, if it's one audience, it could be like the message get across. For all the streaming service, I think what's interesting is that the acquisition is really centered around like the new shows that are coming in the catalog. So how I've seen like a lot of like posters, out of homes. Of course, there's like some paid and performance, but if that's like a regular content schedule, that's something you could plan right now for like 2023. Hey, we're going to have like a marketing channel through like small to mid size to support everything else that we do, and we know that this is the calendar of like new shows that we're going to have next year. So you could pretty much like book how do you call it, like a package of like 2 to 3 videos per creators that we know are really reaching that audience well, so that you just add a new marketing channel to the mix that you have on the audience that you really want to reach for those services. So.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting tactic, and it should be pretty easy to execute as well. So let's see if something like this happens in the future.
We're ready.
But yeah, I mean, that's, I think, all of the biggest points we had set down. So just to summarize this entire process, now that we've talked through all of the details. So again, just to summarize, how do you go about setting up a winning creator marketing strategy for 2023? So start with the basic details. What are your overall marketing goals, and how can creators support that? What's going to be your initial budget for creators, and what kind of results do you require to start scaling up the budgets? Who's going to be your initial target audience that you're going to be targeting? Because that will help you guide which platforms and what kind of creators will you be hiring, and then what are the special activations throughout the year that you need to prepare for with a longer time frame. Once you have the basic details down, go about discussing the more nuanced aspects. How do you scale it up when you get the results? Is it going to be increasing team headcount to handle these things? Are you going to be hiring agencies, or are you going to be using more automation to get this done? What kind of creators will you be hiring? So small, mid-size, big stars, or maybe all of them. Once you decide what kind of creators you're going to be hiring, how do you find them? Do you source manually? Do you ask for rosters from agencies, or do you use more automated platforms that look at the data that, who are the creators that reach your target audience, and then hire them automatically with the help of these solutions? So I think that's pretty much the essentials of it. And if you put these down, you're well on your way to having a great year. And ultimately, it is like any marketing. It's about reaching the right audience at scale with sufficient results. And when you're working with creators, without creators, there is no audience. And creators are the ones that know their audience best. So no matter what you do, is look at who the creator is reaching, and then let them decide what the best kind of content for engaging the audience you want to reach is going to be. And you're going to have great results.
And you do this by having a clear brief to the creator. It's like, of course, it's not like a free flow, but it's just have extensive like information in there so that it's quite clear.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have another episode about best practices for creator briefs later on, but that's definitely something to keep in mind. All right, but I think that's about it for this week's episode. So let's wrap up there, and see you again next.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.